Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in the intro montage of this episode, I did some cleaning on the Aristo's new head. And although this will end up being vapor honed, I at least wanted to scrub as much of the dirt and grime off of it as I could before I begin my portion of the disassembly process. So what I need to do with this head is to pull all of the studs and things along those lines out, at least initially, so that way it can be vapor honed without having to deal with the studs and all things like that. And I'm also going to pull all of the cam caps off, and they are very conveniently, if you can see right there, they are numbered and they are directed. Every single one of them is the same way. Minus, I guess, the two front caps, but those ones are kind of self-explanatory. But all of the studs, these M6x1s, these M8 125s, the M10 125s over on this side, and I need to pull these big plugs out down in the valley, as well as this large plug on the rear, and I want to try to get this coolant nipple out so I can tap this and then run an AN line for that as opposed to a rubber hose. So I have a little bit of work to get done on this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to it, get this thing stripped down, and get it ready, most importantly, to begin porting. But with the Aristo's new head disassembled as far as it needs to be disassembled right now, it's now time to do the last and final modification before port work actually commences. And that is converting this water port on the back side of the head to an NPT thread. So I have my 3/8 NPT tap, which is a 3/8 18 tap, as you guys can see right there. This is a tapered pipe tap. And what I'm going to do is thread this hole so that way I can convert it to an NPT thread and convert this moreover to an AN fitting and be able to run an actual AN line from the back side of the head to wherever I want to run it to. So this should be pretty straightforward and pretty easy. Just simply threading this in and putting some threads into the head. I'll get some WD-40 and we'll use that as thread lubricant, or as cutting lubricant rather. And rather than using a T-handle, I'll just use my ratchet right here and just wind this thing down into the head. So pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and make some threads. with those threads cut in the back of the new head, it's now time to begin porting. But in order to start the porting, I need to pull some old valves out of one of my old mock-up heads. So aside from this thing being really, really grungy, I don't mind that, but I need to pull 2 intake valves and 2 exhaust valves out of this head, so that way I can smooth out and rework the chambers without really worrying about getting into the valve seats and for sure having to replace those. So I'm going to do an old school trick where I'm going to hold a socket on top of one of the retainers and smack it with a hammer. And as you do that, in theory, the valve locks or the valve keepers will come loose and the valve will drop out the bottom of the head. That's the way it works in theory, at least. So let's go ahead and test this in practice and see if it actually is that easy or if this is going to be a fight. All right, let's see how this works. I have the cylinder head placed on a couple of my purge blocks, so that way there's a distance between the bottom of the head and the ground so I don't bend these valves as they're coming out. And I have a glove on, so that'll act as some padding in case I hit myself in the hand. But let's give this a shot. That was extremely easy. Okay. So there's 1 intake valve, 2 intake valves, 1 exhaust, 2 exhaust. Okay. Now I just have to get the valves out of here and we'll be good to go. So you're probably wondering, after the last couple of clips, why was I holding valves up to the belt sander and to my Scotch-Brite wheel? Well, there's a very good reason for it. And this is the finished end product right here. So if you see the valve, I've cut essentially a new angle into it. And I actually stole this idea from my friend Dave over at Head Games. Although his solution and his method of achieving the same thing is certainly more elegant than what I did, but the results are kind of the same thing. So the point of doing this is as I sink the valves down into the seats, as I'm going to have these 4 valves sitting into the seats and everything as I'm reworking the chambers, I machined, with heavy quotation marks, but I ground these so they sit deeper down into the seats. So I can actually blend kind of this edge leading into the seat. I can blend that effectively as I rework the rest of the chamber. So big thanks to Dave and the Head Games crew for publishing that little trade trick. And it'll make this a whole lot easier and make the end product a whole lot nicer. So with all 4 valves in, that's what we're left with. And they feel reasonably even the whole way around. Most importantly, I'll be able to take off these corners to make everything smooth and less likely for there to be hot spots, which we'll talk more about hot spots in the next segment when I actually begin reworking these combustion chambers. But this is shaping up to be really, really nice. And I'm really looking forward to getting some tools in here and starting to rework these chambers. Well, I think the time is finally here to begin working on the actual porting of the Aristo's new head. So I pulled another set of 4 valves out and I put it in this number 2 cylinder. So that way, if the burr catches and skips over, I'm not killing any of the seats over on this side. That's another trick that David Head Games uses, and I'm going to be using a number of the tips and tricks that he provides on the Head Games channel as I'm working on this head. that's by no means, I'm not being coached by Dave or anything like that. So if I screw any of this up, it falls directly on my shoulders as opposed to his whatsoever. But with that disclaimer aside, what I'm going to do is just some basic smoothing and blending of these combustion chambers. So around each of the valve seats, there's kind of a sharp edge there. There's a few other sharp edges, like right here where it goes up to the quench pads and kind of in here. So I'm not necessarily removing a bunch of material. I'm really just smoothing things out, removing those sharp edges that could potentially become a source of detonation, and hopefully not screwing this up in the process. So what I'm going to use to start is this new little McGraw die grinder with a double cut 3/8 burr. These burrs typically are used for steel or stainless or something like that, but it should give me a little bit more control and make things a little bit smoother as I'm working on this, and hopefully everything goes well. So let's go ahead and get to it and see what kind of damage I can do with this. Well, I'm done with my initial rough-in for these combustion chambers, and they don't look too bad. So I did some work up on the sides here. I blended the area in between the valves, and I don't feel like there's any room for hot spots at this point in time. So it's now time to begin sanding. So I'm going to do a two-part sanding process. Right now, I have a 60 grit cartridge roll on the same die grinder, and I'll go through and use that to really begin blending, which I've already started in this area of this combustion chamber. And I'll get everything sanded down to the 60 grit finish, then step up to 120 grit, and then finish off by hand rubbing it with Scotch-Brite to apply a nice final surface finish. So let's go ahead and get to sanding, get that knocked out, and let's see what this cylinder head looks like with the combustion chambers all reworked. And just like that, the chambers on the Aristo's new head are all taken care of. I'm I'm pretty happy with the finished product for these. They're far from perfect, but I don't do this every day, and what I have here is more than good enough. So I didn't remove a whole lot of material, but rather just kind of came in, cleaned up some sharp edges that would be prone to hot spots like I talked about before, and smoothed everything out, and I'm really happy with the finished product. So little spots like this right here, that, so on and so forth, where tooling kind of skipped out of the chambers and hit the actual mating deck surface, that is not a big deal, provided that you don't put a huge gouge into the actual deck surface. Since this will be getting surfaced anyways, little scrubs like those, not a big deal, and they'll be taken out as the head is cut and made flat once again. So now that the chambers are completed, it's now time to move on to the actual ports. But before I do that, I need to punch the guides out of each one of the ports, so that way I can really get in there with tooling and kind of appropriately size everything. And that is where this tool comes into play. So this is from Goodson, and this is a 236,000th or 6mm guide driver. You can see that this particular one sits in the air hammer, and what you do is simply seat it down onto the guide, hammer the guide out, and then you are good to go. So hopefully none of these guides get stuck, hopefully they come out easily, but let's go ahead, give it a shot, see what happens, and get this head ready for actual porting. You may have noticed in those last two clips that my air hammer changed partway through. And my old little Craftsman air hammer wasn't quite up to the task of driving these guides out, so I went and I bought this bad boy from Harbor Freight. And that, in combination with the 6mm Goodson guide driver, allowed me to drive all of the factory guides out. And now that this doesn't have any guides down in any of these guide bores, that means that it's now time to begin working on the actual ports. Well, the time has finally arrived to begin porting the ports on the Aristo's new head. So here you can see what the inside of the port, this is one of the exhaust ports, looks like currently. And you can see a big hump for the guide bosses. And there are some casting marks on the sides of the port, so on and so forth. And you can see some ugliness up in there. So I'm going to focus most of my efforts around the short turn radius and the bowl area, as that is where you make the most gains on these heads. But since I have all the time in the world to do this, and there's some casting ugliness in here that I'm not super keen on, I'm going to at least get tools on pretty much every bit of the surface area of all of these ports. Now, it's debatable if doing the entire port actually makes a difference, but if I'm already getting tools in there, I want to knock everything down that I can, smooth everything out, so on and so forth. So I've gone ahead already, and on one of my other heads, I did some test cuts with this Spiral Flute Head Games burr. It works really, really well. It's nice and smooth, not jumpy or jerky or anything like that. It gives me a really nice feel as I'm doing this, and should equate to a nice, at least initial ground surface finish before I go in and actually sand everything smooth at the end of this. So I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and start making a big aluminum chip mess, and let's see what kind of damage I can do to this head. All of the grinding on the exhaust side is completed, and the bowls are sized appropriately. So everything, if you guys can see, is looking pretty good. I'll give some more detailed photos in a detailed video later on. But for now, it's time to rinse and repeat and do the same process on the intake side. grinding on the intake ports is now completed, and they came out pretty nicely. I'm very happy with them. So if you guys can see in here, let's see, I removed a little bit more material on these than the exhaust side. Kind of down in these bowl areas, there were some ugly casting outcroppings that are no longer there. I smoothed everything out, and most importantly, with my inside caliper, I've achieved the dimension that I needed on every single one of these bowls. So what I was shooting for with these bowls was 88% of the valve's OD. And rather than me kind of fiddling my way through an explanation, let's go ahead and cut over to Dave at Head Games, giving a much more concise and educated explanation of why this is than what I'll be able to.
What we'll do is we'll measure this and we'll measure the valve, and we're going to port this to a certain percentage of the size of the valve. So you see here that the bowl is 1,146 and the valve is 1,319. So we measure the valve, we measure the bowl, and now we're going to go into the calculator. So in the calculator, we're going to do 1.148, divide that by the size of the valve, and that's 1,320, equals 87%. So there is some room for activities. I would just say your guide is you do not want to be over 90% of the size of the valve. You can be within 87 to 90, and there is some room there to port it, and just don't be that guy who goes and makes the bowl right to the 45, because now you'll make it too big and you're going to slow the air down.
So hopefully Dave's explanation made sense, and he is the master of working on heads. So I took what he said as gospel and applied it to this head. So at this point in time, now that grinding is completed, it's time to begin actually sanding. And what I'm going to do is apply a 60 grit surface finish to the intake side, and I'll do a 60 grit initial sand on the exhaust side and finish up with 120, as the exhaust side can be a little bit slicker than the intake side. So let me go ahead and get the grinder set up with some cartridge rolls, and I'm also using this auxiliary air pressure regulator on my grinder so I can turn the speed down and achieve a little bit more control, most importantly, but I'll be able to achieve a really nice surface finish on the inside of all of these ports, and we'll end up with a really nice end product. The intake side is completely sanded at this point in time. I have a nice 60 grit surface finish around or through every single one of these ports. You can see the nice finish there. And 60 grit ensures that the air traveling through the port doesn't travel at such a high velocity that it doesn't have time to atomize with the fuel correctly. Or at least that's my understanding of it. So now that the intake side is done, we have one more stage of sanding to do. And that is to take the exhaust ports up to a 120 grit surface finish. The exhaust side, since we're not worried about fuel atomization in those ports, can be done to a finer surface finish, hence the 120 grit. So let me flip the head around, get the grinder set up, and let's get this head knocked out and get this finished up. Just like that, porting on the Aristo's head is completed. So this is certainly far from perfect, as I am not a machinist or a porter by trade, but I did the best that I could, and I'm really happy with the end result. So the intake side, everything is nice and smooth. It's done up to a 60 grit finish. So that way we can actually have proper atomization of air and fuel. The exhaust side is done to a 120 grit finish and then Scotch-Brited on top of that. And as you guys saw before as well, the chambers are smoothed, they are ported, and they're done to a 120 grit and Scotch-Brite finish as well. So with the tools that I have and the little bit of grinding and porting skills that I have, I was able to get this knocked out, and we will see when the head goes on the car and the car is up and running with its new engine, if I was actually able to benefit this engine and benefit the cylinder head, or if this was all for nothing and if I screwed everything up. This is the same as most of what I do on this channel, just a big experiment, and I'm really excited to see what the end results of it are. I'd like to issue a huge thank you to my friend Dave over at Head Games. Between texting back and forth with him to get a few little tips and tricks for the cylinder head porting, as well as the huge library of tech videos, how-tos, things along those lines that he has on the Head Games channel, which I will link in the description, and it should be on the screen somewhere here at the same time. Taking his nearly 30 years of experience as a machinist, a cylinder head specialist, a very skilled porter, if not one of the most skilled porters in the world, that is an invaluable resource for anybody that is looking to play around with a cylinder head or just learn how cylinder heads work, what is a benefit, what's a detriment, so on and so forth. I didn't exactly follow his recipe with this cylinder head, as I kind of went off and did my own thing in a few regards, not for the sake of thinking that I know how to do these things better, but for the sake of wanting to play around, wanting to learn, and wanting to be able to say that I ported the head on this car. So if it works well, that's fantastic. If not, then I guess I'll be getting another GE VVTi head, sending it Dave's way, and having somebody who actually knows what they're doing knock it out, so I have a verified good head on this car. But with the head porting done, the fab room cleaned up for the most part, and me ready for the next stage and the next project, I think that'll be a good point to leave off for this episode. So thank you guys, as always, for coming along on all of these different journeys and all of these different adventures with me. This was a really fun one that I've really been looking forward to, kind of stepping outside of my wheelhouse and playing around with something that I don't do every day. And I learned a bunch, I got some cool new tools, and now have another thing to add to my resume that I have done. Although I have ported heads before, this is by far the most in-depth I've gotten with one and the nicest one that I've done so far. So beyond the Aristo and all of that, the block is up at Accelerated. They're working their magic on it, and very soon we'll be able to assemble the engine, get it ready to go into the car whenever I feel the need to do that. Beyond the Aristo though, the Mark II is now up and operational. We'll go over that in the next few episodes. And I've also done a little bit of car shuffle, putting the Mark IV up on the lift. I have a few things I want to do on it. And then the SC, just need to take it out and do some more driving and street tuning. And it is also the proud owner of a new front lip. So there are a lot of things to look forward to, and I can't wait to get started on this next round of projects. But those are all things that will be coming in the future, because we're done with this one now. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and check out the website for manifolds, for merch, for all things good that way, including my MCB collection. That is the newest apparel and accessory line that I have for you guys, and it can be found in the MCB collection link in the description below. So if anything there is interesting to you and you would like to pick it up, by all means, feel free to do so. And if nothing there does speak to you and you would not like to add any of it to your collection, that's all right as well. Hopefully I offer something in the future that you do find interesting and that you would like to add to your collection. But with all of that being said, that will be the end of this one, and I will see you guys in the next episode.